what spiritual leadership is. And today looking at what it is not. And hopefully it will help to understand and define what real spiritual leadership is. There is a revolution going on in the churches of Christ nationwide. And some of the traditions are steadily falling. And there are some churches who are die-hard traditional. And because of that, they are dying. They are dying. The ones who are seeking to serve God in the capacity in which He has established, they have noted significant growth. Those others are just a shell of what they used to be. In Luke chapter 12, I want to focus on 41 and 44, although we're going to go through this text. This PowerPoint has a lot of scripture in it. I put the scriptures within the PowerPoint, so you might just want to take notes. It might be easier. The scriptures, well, I've written out all the scriptures, so you might just want to take notes of the scriptures. Peter asked a question, Lord, and I have all these in the NIV, by the way. Lord, are you telling this parable to us or to everyone? The Lord answered, who then is the faithful and wise manager, whom the master puts in charge of his servants to give them their food allowance at the proper time? It will be good for that servant when the master finds doing so when he returns. I tell you the truth, he will put him in charge of all his possessions. When we look at this text in the light of spiritual leadership, we see that indeed God has entrusted some things into his people. And it's on multiple levels. If you use the analogy that was given in Exodus 18, where Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, came to him and said, Moses, there is no way that you can continue to rule these people day and night as they come to you. It would wear you down. You need to establish leadership in such a way that there will be groups. He says thousands, hundreds, and tens. That those folks who he deemed fit, as he trained them, would be able to manage the affairs of the people so Moses didn't have to do it all by himself. That's a paraphrase of Exodus 18. But Jesus here says, and he told a parable, and we're going to look at that parable in just a moment, but he says to Peter and the rest of them who were listening that there would be those who would be entrusted to do good by God's things, meaning that they would be stewards of what God has placed them over. When we consider what we mean by stewardship, we need to look at leadership as stewardship. Stewardship is defined as the conducting, supervising, or managing of something, especially the careful and responsible management of something entrusted to one's care. We talk about stewardship of our natural resources. Our natural resources came from God. Obviously, there is more attention now than it was in years past on them, but we haven't always been good stewards as a nation of our natural resources. They have been something entrusted into us, and we have not been good stewards over that. But this gives you an idea of God's economy as it relates to stewardship, because God has entrusted certain things into us. That it was there, we had no control or say-so about it. He entrusted us to deal with it in a way that He would, because it actually belongs to Him. When we consider that, Paul instructs Timothy in his stewardship over the church in 1 Timothy 4, 11 through 16, and 2 Timothy 4, 1 through 6, and we talked about these last Sunday. He entrusts him as an evangelist to do some things that set the church in order, things that are wanting, to command and teach certain things, and he was placed there for that. Titus was exactly the same in the role of an evangelist, and God entrusted them to do that. Elders and deacons in their stewardship over the church, Paul has instructed them as well. In Acts 20, 28 through 30, and 1 Timothy 3, 1 through 13, clearly points out the stewardship of those positions as God has entrusted in them a work to do. Husbands in their stewardship over their families in Ephesians 5, 25 and 31, Colossians 3, 19 through 21. Clearly it speaks of the husband's stewardship over his family, a possession that he did not acquire on his own. He had no say-so to which kids would be his, but God entrusted them. That is his stewardship. And then, of course, Christians in their stewardship over themselves. Galatians, Colossians, 1 John, and several other New Testament passages in Paul's writing that God entrusted ourselves. He says that you are going to offer your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. He's giving you stewardship over that. He's giving you stewardship over your mind. You're not an animal. Animals have instinct. He gave us intellect and says, now do something with it. He gave us the ability to understand the gospel, to follow what's right and wrong, and discern those things. He gave us that ability. And that is our accountability to him, is our stewardship. And it's in every form of leadership in God's economy. It is the way that God has been himself. Spirituality versus carnality gives us some insight on how to understand, how to negotiate these relationships. In Romans chapter 8, verses 5 through 9, listen to Paul's words. He says, those who live according to the sinful nature have their minds set on what that nature desires. But those who live in accordance with the Spirit have their minds set on what the Spirit desires. The mind of sinful man is death, but the mind controlled by the Spirit is life and peace. The sinful mind is hostile to God. It does not submit to God's law, nor can it do so. Nor can it do so. Those controlled by the spiritual, or sinful rather, nature cannot please God. You, however, Paul says, are controlled not by the sinful nature, but by the Spirit. If the Spirit of God lives in you, and if anyone does not have the Spirit of Christ, he does not belong to Christ. Now, I want you to notice in verse number 9, Paul says to the church, you, however, are not controlled by the sinful nature, but by the Spirit. And then he follows that up with if. It is not an automatic or absolute that because you're in the Lord's church or because you attend there regularly, that you're in the right nature. He says if the Spirit of God lives in you, he speaks then of the Spirit of God. How does the Spirit of God live in us? Sure, we've received an indwelling measure, but exactly how does that happen? It's going to happen in our obedience and accountability to God and our stewardship. It's how we act. It's how we respond. It's what we do. Those things prove what it is that we claim we believe. But if we still deal in the sinful nature, if our mind is still controlled by worldly things, if we still produce a habit of carnality, there is no way that we will ever exercise spirituality. We can't. And Paul goes on as far to say in verse 7 that that sinful mind is hostile toward God and it won't submit to the law. It can't. It can't. So you can throw as many scriptures up to that sinful mind as you want to. You can point out however many scriptures you want. You can model whatever behavior that is Christianity before them. They are not going to get it. Remember when the rich man and Lazarus in that story, the rich man obviously went to a place after death that he wasn't comfortable with. But when he was in that state, he recognized, albeit too late, that his lifestyle was incorrect. And he wanted to send some people back. He wanted to warn his brothers, his father, his family. He wanted them to know that they don't want to be in the state that he's in. They were living just like him, and they were fooled to believe that they had the right nature. But they didn't. They didn't. And so because of that, he wanted to send somebody back. But Abraham said to him, you know what? If they don't believe the prophets, they ain't going to believe anybody we send back now. But what is in that statement? He understood something about the sinful mind. Because the sinful mind ain't going to get it. It doesn't want to. And that's the choice of a sinful mind. So when we talk about a sinful mind or the sinful nature,